Not long ago I did a video on how some European countries signed the Minsk Accords just to deceive Russia and continue to provide Ukraine with more and more weapons with the purpose of causing a war in the future. This was confirmed by Angela Merkel, François Hollande, Petro Poroshenko and Volodymyr Zelensky. This is already shocking because the so-called leaders in Europe signed peace deals, but never really meant to follow them. They actually used those peace deals as means to create a war. This is criminal. This was the engineering of a war that could, and already did, cause the death of hundreds of thousands of people. And today I'm going to tell you that this wasn't the only time that the United States and European Union prevented peace between Ukraine and Russia. After Russia started its special military operation in February 2022, the Western media started one of the largest propaganda campaigns ever made. Myths and legends were created about Ukrainian military units forcing Russian soldiers to retreat, and also the narrative that Ukraine was winning the war. But all of those narratives were just lies, purely fabricated to create the idea that sending billions in money, weapons and ammunition to Ukraine was bearing fruits. One of the biggest lies was the so-called Siege of Kiev, where the Western media created the narrative that when the Russians left the areas around Kiev, it was because the Ukrainians fought and expelled them from those areas. But none of this is true. So what really happened around Kiev? To answer that question, we have to go back to early March 2022, when peace negotiations started between Ukraine and Russia. These negotiations were held in Istanbul, and the mediators were President Erdogan, Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, and also former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. Naftali Bennett detailed that both Ukraine and Russia wanted to end hostilities, and made big concessions in order to achieve that. Russia, for example, would not pursue demilitarization in Ukraine, and Ukraine would not join NATO. There were many details still to be negotiated, such as what happens to the Donbas region, but it was clear Ukraine and Russia were on their way to reach peace. They even drafted a document with the proposals on the table to reach peace and stop the war. And this is the text of the Istanbul Communique of March 29, 2022. However, as Bennett also mentioned, the United States and the United Kingdom did not want these peace negotiations to continue. Because Ukraine is not an independent state, it requires the approval of the United States government to do anything. And the Biden administration immediately rejected these peace negotiations. Bennett said at the peace negotiations in early March 2022 in Istanbul with Rustem Umerov, the Ukrainians did not agree to peace because they were not allowed to. They first had to ask the Americans about everything they discussed. Bennett also added, but at the end of the peace negotiations, nothing happened. My impression was that nothing could happen because everything else was decided in Washington, and that was fatal. The Turkish foreign minister echoed what Bennett said as well. He added, some NATO states wanted the Ukraine conflict to continue in order to weaken Russia. In March 24, 2022, in a special NATO summit in Brussels, NATO countries opposed all negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Joe Biden attended this special summit to guarantee that no one in NATO supported these negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. While all of this was going on, Ukraine and Russia were still continuing to negotiate peace. On the 28th of March 2022, and given how well negotiations were going thus far, Vladimir Putin agreed to withdraw Russian troops from around Kiev and Kharkov as a sign of goodwill. And on the 29th of March 2022, Turkey's President Erdogan hosted a Ukraine-Russia peace conference in Istanbul, and an armistice agreement was approved in principle with the proposals that I already mentioned. Also on the 29th of March 2022, Olaf Scholz, Joe Biden, Mario Draghi, Emmanuel Macron and Boris Johnson talked again about these peace negotiations to make sure they could not continue. They set conditions for the negotiations to even happen, conditions that would oppose everything already agreed between Ukraine and Russia, in effect destroying the mediation efforts of President Erdogan, Naftali Bennett and Gerhard Schroeder. On the 6th of April of 2022, all Russian troops withdrew from Kiev and Kharkov areas. And on the 9th of April 2022, Boris Johnson arrives in Kiev, Ukraine, to deliver the message that NATO countries agreed on, which was to end these peace negotiations immediately, and Zelensky was instructed to not make any concessions to Russia. And the rest is history. The war only really started after this. Up to the 9th of April 2022, peace negotiations were underway between Ukraine and Russia, and violence and killing was limited. But after the United States, United Kingdom and NATO countries sabotaged these peace negotiations, the amount of violence and killing increased significantly in Ukraine. Once again, the United States, United Kingdom and NATO countries were the engineers of another war, and when faced with peace negotiations, they did everything to sabotage them, exactly as they did with the Minsk Accords. On the 25th of April 2022, the United States Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated clearly that the objective of the United States was to use this opportunity to weaken Russia.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine.
And this was done militarily and economically too, which is why so many sanctions were imposed on Russia, as well as millions in money and weapons were sent to Ukraine to continue the war. And as I showed you in another video, this was prepared by the United States for many years. The United States provided weapons and training to Ukrainian military for a long time, basically ever since 2014, when the United States engineered a coup in Ukraine that gave power to Nazi groups. The objective to weaken Russia was clearly stated in the RAND Corporation report. RAND is a think tank for the United States industrial military complex. Having said all this, and as you can see, there was no siege of Kiev, nor did the Ukrainians win any battle against Russian troops around Kiev, because it never happened. The siege of Kiev is another piece of Western propaganda with no relation with reality. And this also led to the Bucha massacre narrative, that Russian forces killed civilians in Bucha and then retreated from the Kiev area because they were under attack from Ukrainian forces. But this is all a lie. The Bucha massacre did happen, but it wasn't done by Russian forces. It was done by Ukrainian Nazi groups, part of the Ukrainian military, that have been killing civilians in eastern Ukraine since 2014, which I already talked about in several other videos. What didn't happen was the retreat of Russian forces because they were under attack by Ukrainian forces. There was no retreat. Russian forces withdrew from the areas around Kiev and Kharkov because that was part of what Ukraine and Russia agreed during the peace negotiations in Istanbul. Peace negotiations that were sabotaged by the United States, United Kingdom and NATO countries. For more than 70 years, NATO countries have been responsible for many wars, for the murder of millions of people, for the bombing and destruction of several countries. Ukraine is just their latest victim. Ukraine is nothing more than a proxy of the United States and NATO against Russia. Plus, Russia is far too powerful for NATO countries to fight it directly. NATO countries needed a proxy, a slave country to sacrifice against Russia in hopes that Ukraine could at least do some damage to Russia. In essence, Ukrainians supply their bodies and blood, while NATO supplies the money, the weapons, and the ammunition. And the previous defense minister of Ukraine said as much.
Ми виконуємо місію НАТО сьогодні без втрати їхньої крові, з втратою нашої крові. Тому для них треба витрачати їх зброю.
And just like Vietnam, Iraq, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria, Ukraine joins the ranks of countries used and destroyed by NATO countries. The United States of America, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and other NATO countries are always saying countries like Russia or China are part of an axis of evil. However, reality shows who is always in favor of war and always against peace. The sabotage of the peace agreement in Istanbul being the latest example of that. They are the real axis of evil. I hope you like this, and I'll see you next time.